Hello YouTube, this is Hey Guys Laughing Out Loud. I'm here today to provide you with my own personal overall review of the DS4 Evil Shift controller from Evil Controllers. But before we get started, a bit of a disclaimer. I want to mention in a full disclosure that I purchased the Evil Shift controller from Evil Controllers with my own money. At the time and posting of this video, I am in no way affiliated with Evil Controllers. All of my personal opinions are my own. No one is paying me for this review, and no one is viewing this review before it is posted. I'm just a consumer gamer that wants to provide consumers and Evil Controllers with my overall impressions and feedback about this controller. So let's start out by taking an overall look at the controller before we begin to dissect it. So as you can see, this is the actual Evil Shift controller. And this is the front face of it. And I've had a bit of time over the weekend to play around with it to see just how much I was going to actually like it. And then I give a rear view here. And of course, I do have a stock controller here, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with. And if you can also notice the difference with the stock and Evil Shift controllers. Try to get them in the frame there. And as you can see, the Evil Shift controller is a modded Sony DS4 stock controller. Now, the difference between a modded controller and a modified controller is that a modded controller has a third-party circuit board installed to the controller that will generally provide a specific in-game function that usually gives an unfair advantage while gaming, and is generally not permitted in any kind of tournaments. However, a modified controller is a controller that has some kind of cosmetic features added, but the controller essentially functions the same. For example, if you were to add thumbstick pads or trigger stops or paddle buttons as seen in the Evil Shift controller. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Evil Shift controller, as mentioned earlier, it is a Tournament Edition Pro controller, and it is offered in Xbox and PS4 format. And it has been modified by adding 4 additional rear paddle buttons, which include button remapping that is very similar to what we have seen from other Pro controllers, such as the Xbox Elite controller, for those of you who are not familiar. And also, you're probably familiar with Scuff, AIM, and Beaver controllers, just to name a few. There's actually quite a few different Pro controller options out there, and Evil Controllers is definitely one of them. Now, however, the main difference being between the rear shift paddle button design by Evil Controllers is claimed to be far superior when compared to other paddle systems. And based on my experience with this particular controller, I would have to agree with that statement. So the first thing I want to jump right into is the Evil Shift paddle buttons. And I will be breaking down each section into pros and cons. So let's go ahead and jump into the paddle buttons and get a bit of a closer look at them. So the first major pro that I want to discuss is the responsiveness of these buttons when they're actually depressed. They're very sensitive, they're very responsive, and the switches actually feel very much like mechanical switches. If any of you are experienced with mechanical keyboards, it feels like that, just on a smaller version of a button. Now, the distance surface, if you notice here, so if I can get it in frame, if you notice here, the distance surface between the button, the grip, and the bottom of the button is actually about 1/4 of an inch. And when you depress it, it actually depresses, I'd say roughly about 1/16 of an inch, which is really good. And in the actual photos, you don't really get to see that, and you don't really know. You don't really have that information, so you're kind of blind on that. So now you know. The buttons can be applied. The buttons can be triggered by applying pressure from multiple angles. So, for example, obviously, if you were to press the button like straight down, it's obviously going to depress. It's going to trigger that button and execute whatever the command is. However, and this is where the shift comes in play, you can actually depress the button by pressing the button to the side from any side or any angle. So I'm pushing it, towards the left, it's actually depressing the button. And if I press it to the right, it's also going to depress the button. And same if I were to press it from the bottom or from the top. And which means like pretty much from any direction, like if you were to consider it almost like a D-pad, it's going to basically fire off and execute this particular button. And that's going to be effective for all the shift buttons. And that's why this is essentially what sets it apart from the other paddle systems and some of the other controllers. Because if you look at the Xbox Elite controller here, now this paddle system is very similar to a lot of other paddle systems that you're going to find from other pro controllers. And basically what you have is, and let me remove one of the paddles on this, is you essentially have a button here that gets depressed, and there's this little paddle that fits in. This one's actually magnetized, and when you press it, it executes that button. And it actually works pretty good, despite what some people may think. I mean, I've had pretty good success with it. However, depending on how you're playing and how you're holding it, if these paddles are not necessarily fit to your comfort, you may actually want to press the paddle from the side or at an angle, and you can't do that with this. You have to press straight down in order to trigger that button. So that's why the shift paddle buttons on the Evil controller, the Evil Shift controller, is a far superior design system versus what you're going to see from your standard paddle system. And this paddle system is for the most part going to be the same with most of the pro controllers. Of course, you're going to have some various differences, maybe positioning and whatnot, but as far as the functionality, it's essentially going to be about the same. So you're not going to get what you will get from this controller of being able to basically, fire off that button from any angle. Now, one of the things that I really like about the Evil Shift, the buttons, is also the shape of the buttons and the actual, in the positioning of the buttons, and in regards to, where they actually lay, and the fact that they've actually added like a rubber texture surface to it versus, if you get like a paddle system like on the Xbox Elite, this is like a metal paddle system. So when I'm actually holding this and trying to use it, it can be, depending on how you're trying to execute the buttons, it can actually cause like issues with your hands and your fingers. It's not a real big issue, but I can see it being an issue for some people. But based on the shape and the surface texture of these buttons, it's not really going to be an issue. So that's one of the really good things. The next point I want to talk about in regards to the shift paddle buttons is if you have the controller and you actually lay it down on a flat surface, you're not going to have to worry about the buttons depressing from the surface that it's sitting on, because it actually is completely, there's actually just enough, surface area and where it's actually positioned, that when it lays down, it will not execute the buttons, which is a good thing, because one of the problems with the Xbox Elite controller is, if you can tell by me holding it at an angle there, you notice that this paddle button actually extends past the grip. So when you lay it down, it actually depresses that button. And that is a problem. I've had problems with that, and I've even, been playing a game and it's gotten me killed because I go to lay the controller down. So it's a pretty annoying feature there that fortunately with the EvilShift that they've been able to consider. Now, I want to get into the next topic in regards to the buttons, is kind of a mix of a pro and a con, and depending on how you choose to use this controller is going to pretty much determine whether this next section to talk about is going to be a pro or a con for you. Now, for me, it ended up turning to be a pro. So what you need to understand about these, about the paddle buttons, is that the EvilShift paddle buttons are implemented in a way that they are not independent buttons like the buttons found in the Xbox Elite controller. So, for example, let me flip these over. Okay, so what I mean by this is, on the Xbox One Elite controller here, you can map buttons to these paddle buttons, and they're independent. So what that means is you can actually give these paddle buttons different actions. For example, let's say you want 2 A buttons. Okay, so you've got your A button on the front here, and then you map, another A button to one of these rear paddle buttons. Okay. And let's say you want one of those A buttons to have turbo and one without. Okay. Well, because these are independent buttons, you can actually implement one with turbo and one without, which is basically, essentially, you have 4 additional buttons. However, on the EvilShift controller, that is not the case. With the EvilShift controller, these are mirrored buttons. They are not independent. So whatever button you map them to, for example, if you map the square button, if you will, to one of the paddle buttons, and you add turbo to that front face square button, it is going to mirror whatever paddle button you map that square button to. So that, again, that's something that you really want to be aware of when considering buying this controller, because depending on how you're going to be using it. Like for me, for example, I'm using it both for PC and a console, and in the PC side, I'm using the Steam software. So with the Steam software, it's not going to read these buttons. So because it doesn't read the buttons or detect them, I cannot map them. But since these are mirrored, I basically can map whatever I want to any of the buttons on the controller, the front face buttons or the D-pad or the triggers or whatever, to any of these EvilShift buttons, and it's essentially going to work. Unfortunately, because it's mirroring it, I have duplicate buttons instead of open buttons. However, on the Xbox Elite controller, unfortunately, again, with the Steam software, you cannot, it doesn't even detect these additional paddle buttons, but since they're not mirrored, you can map out all the buttons, but since it's not mirrored, these buttons are pretty much useless. Well, it is and it isn't. It's useless in the Steam software. However, you can use another software package, such as the Xbox accessories software within Windows that you can get from the Windows Store, and you can map these independently to any of the buttons on the controller, or you can get another third-party program, which I found, and the only program that does offer support for the paddle buttons, and it's called REWASD. That's REWASD. Unfortunately, the software does have some pretty big limitations, but if you just need basic button mapping for something like this, it will definitely do the job. But it is only going to work on the Xbox Elite because of the fact that those are independent buttons versus mirrored buttons here. Okay, so we're kind of done talking about that. Let's go ahead and move into the cons of these paddle buttons, because unfortunately, nothing's ever perfect. There's always room for improvement. So the first con is for me, and again, this is due to my hand size and how I hold the controller when I game. These paddle buttons, unfortunately, when I hold and I'm gaming, I generally hold the controller like this. I keep my thumbs on the thumbsticks, and essentially I've got my knuckles right around the edge here. I don't like to use the tips of my thumbs. I don't like to play like that. I know some people do. I just don't. I actually play with my knuckle right at the edge, and it allows me, and like I said, due to my hand size and how I grip, it allows me to have my index finger right in between my bumper and trigger. So I've got, a good reach on all the buttons. But if you notice, and I'm pretty much naturally holding the controller as I would be playing. If you notice, the fingers that that are over my shift paddle buttons, it's my ring finger and my pinky finger. Okay. Now, when I grab the Xbox Elite controller, if I'm holding it naturally, which I would usually be holding it like this, if you notice, it's kind of hard to see, but naturally, the way the paddles are laid out and the way I would naturally grip this controller, my ring finger, my middle finger would depress the top button, and my ring finger would depress the bottom button. And for those of you who are, not familiar, generally speaking, when you're thinking about responsiveness from your hands, the most responsive fingers in your hands are going to be your index finger and your middle finger and your thumb. Your ring finger and your pinky finger, they're not useless, but they're not the most responsive fingers that you're going to be getting when you're doing your gameplay. And this is just basic anatomy, 101 as far as ergonomics about, how the human hands actually work. Now, does that mean that those fingers are useless? No, absolutely not. You can train them, and you can probably train them to be more responsive, but it is going to take a bit more work, which I found out over the weekend, because over the weekend, this controller, I was having a bit of a hard time with it, because I kept trying to hold the controller like this, where I had the middle finger and my ring finger on the shift paddle buttons like I would with the Elite, but I couldn't get my thumbs to stay positioned correctly on my thumbsticks and my index fingers positioned for the trigger and bumpers at a comfortable level. And again, a lot of that is due to my hand size and the way I'm holding the controller. But I have to go with the most natural feel, and the most natural feel and due to my hand size is to hold it like this and to use the ring and pinky finger. And like I said, I really did not like that. But after playing with it a little bit Friday night, didn't get to do too much Friday night, and playing with it Saturday night, by Sunday, I was already pretty adapted to it. I was already used to it, but my fingers, as far as the responsiveness, was still quite not there. And I think with time and a little bit of training with my hands, I think it'll get better, because I noticed a big jump in performance just coming from Friday to Sunday. So it's basically just having to relearn and train myself, kind of like when you're learning to type for the first time. So this is just something that you definitely want to think about, and For example, if you've got any kind of disability with your hands, maybe you're missing a pinky finger, like Swifty, the gamer, he's missing his left pinky finger. Well, he wouldn't be able to use this paddle because he doesn't have a pinky. So if you have a problem like that, you know, you're going to be kind of out of luck on there. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is in regards to a con is I kind of wish that these paddle buttons are plastic, and they've, as I mentioned earlier, and they've got like this rubber textured, you know, surface over them, which is nice, but the plastic does kind of concern me because I just don't feel like it doesn't really give me peace of mind that the plastic is going to last. And like if you notice with like the Elite controller, being that they use these metal paddle buttons, at the end of the day, if anything gives out, it's going to be the button underneath because that's the only moving part. And as far as the material of what's being used, this is metal. I mean, unless you're, you know, having a rage moment and you throw your controller, this is not going to break. And I'm not one of those types of gamers that rages, but I know some people are that way. So if you're the type of person to do that and maybe get pissed off and throw your controller down, being the fact that these are plastic, I hope you earn a good income because you'd end up having to, you know, probably buy a new controller. But I would have preferred that they had made these with metal, maybe like a stainless steel or aluminum. Probably stainless steel would be preferred. And then maybe even take it a step further and actually make them removable, very much like the thumb grips that we see in the Xbox Elite controller, where you can just like, you know, actually have them magnetized where they come on and off. In fact, even take it a step further, instead of just having it magnetized where you just drop it on top of it, because obviously you got gravity to contend with, which I don't think would be an issue because these magnets are pretty strong. But actually you could maybe take it a step further and have the thumb, the shift paddle magnetized, but when you put it on and then twist it to lock it in place, and it's magnetized. So you have like a double system. And it's metal, so you know it's going to last. You know you've got like a rock solid build quality there. I really don't like the plastic. Now, don't get me wrong. Even though this is plastic, it doesn't feel cheap. I mean, these buttons feel good. They feel responsive. So I don't want to make it sound like they're selling us this cheap, low-end product because that's not the case. I'm just saying I would have preferred, you know, a metal paddle just to, you know, have better build quality. Okay, and again, you know, the other con, as I already mentioned, is these aren't removable. So, I mean, it would be, you know, like if one breaks, you might be able to send in the controller and then they got to go in and tear it all apart and put in a new one, or they may just tell you need a new controller. But if you were to have these removable, then for whatever reason, I don't see them breaking, but you probably could just replace the actual shift paddle just by, you know, getting a new one. And not only that, if they were removable, you could probably, you know, make your own and custom shape them however you want, just in case this particular shapes aren't fitting for you. Just, you know, it's all about options, and, you know, we like options. The next thing I want to talk about isn't really a big issue for me. Is they have opted to remove the rumble motors out of each grip here, because they're actually located, one's on this side and one's on the other side, and they had to remove them in order to implement this paddle system. And that's really not an issue for me. You know, I can live without the rumble. It's nice to have for certain games. But what I don't like about them removing those rumble motors is this controller, when you compare it to the stock controller, has a significant difference in weight. Like this controller, the stock controller from Sony, it's got a good weight to it. It's not too heavy. It's not too light. I mean, to me, again, this is subjective, but to me, it's just got a good weight to it. And one of the things and the problems that I had when I bought the Xbox Elite controller, and one of the things I really don't like about it, this thing is heavy. This controller weighs probably just as much as these two controllers combined. That's how heavy this thing is. And I really don't like the weight of this. But this controller, the Evil Shift controller, because they've removed those rumble motors, is just feather light. I mean, and I don't want to say like I completely hate it, because I don't, but I think what I would have liked to have seen is an option where, like what you see in a lot of PC gaming mouse these days, where maybe they could have a hole cut out here that you can slide some weights in and then lock it, and have that on both sides, so that way you can add some weight to it and it's going to feel very much like the stock controller in regards to the actual weight. Again, to some of you guys, that may not be an issue, but for me, I like to have just a good amount of weight to it. That's just me. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next section, which is the front face buttons here. These buttons here. Now, this is actually going to be a little bit shorter because there's not a lot to say, but these front face buttons here, they're very responsive. Like when you press them, it feels like mechanical switches, just like in the description on their website. And it feels good when you press them. And there's a nice confirmation. You're not going to really hear the sound from them because I'm actually using a Bluetooth headset. But there is a nice click sound to them versus the stock controller. There's a click sound, but it's very different. It's not quite the same. I like the way the Evil Shift feels as far as the press of the button. However, and now we're going to get into the con, these buttons are very loose. And what I mean by that is when you rub your fingers over these buttons, you can literally hear the jiggle from that. Now I'm going to try to put the Bluetooth headset close to it and rub it a bit, so hopefully you guys can hear it. So let me do that now. So I don't know if y'all can hear that or not, but now I'm going to put the DS stock, the Sony stock controller, and do the same thing. And I'm just rubbing my fingers across the surface of them. I mean, it's night and day. The stock controller is very, very quiet, and it feels more solid. Now, granted, the buttons when you depress them don't feel as good as the Evil Shift buttons when you depress them. But other than that, other than the mechanical buttons and the responsiveness of how they feel when they click and how sensitive they are, because these are very sensitive buttons, you will notice a difference in your gameplay in regards to the sensitivity and responsiveness. But aside from that, these buttons feel so much better. So I'm wondering if they could do something where they could do like a marriage between the two in regards to the design, so you could get the benefits of these mechanical responsive switches or buttons here, but have them feel more higher quality, like on the stock controller. Now, not to get off too far off on a rabbit hole here, but there are newer mechanical keyboards that any of you who have experience with mechanical keyboards knows how loud they are when you type on them for the most part. But over the last couple of years, they've been experimenting with newer mechanical keyboards that are hybrids. And basically they're mechanical keyboards, but they also have a rubber membrane implemented as well. So they're a lot quieter, but you still get the benefit of a mechanical switch. So it's responsive. So I'm wondering if they couldn't do something similar with these front face buttons. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to the next section, which is the D-pad. So we're going to talk about the D-pad here. So the D-pad, on the Evil Shift controller, there is a difference, but the difference, and this is going to be a short section, the difference is ever so slight. There's not a lot of difference between the D-pad of the Evil Shift and the D-pad of the stock controller. The main difference is on the Evil Shift controller, it feels slightly better, in my opinion, meaning it doesn't feel quite as stiff. There's not as much tension or resistance. So if you're a heavy-handed person, which generally I am generally a heavy-handed person, it might not be comfortable to you. For me, it's actually comfortable, but the stock controller, I mean, actually requires quite a bit more pressure and tension in order to execute. So there is a difference there, and I do like the new D-pad, so I like that. All right, so we're now going to move on to the triggers, the triggers of the Evil Shift controller. Okay, so the triggers on the Evil Shift controller, again, there's not a lot to talk about, but they are a lot more responsive or sensitive, if you will, than the Sony stock controller. So, I mean, I literally, when I was playing Witcher 3 the other day, and I would barely press this thing and it would execute, versus whenever I would, press the trigger on the stock controller, it would not. So that is something that, that may be a benefit or may not, but I particularly like that. So that's a good thing, in my opinion. Now let's get into the cons. There's only really one. There are no trigger stops to these triggers. Now, if you notice, and of course on the stock controller, there's also no trigger stops. But on the Xbox Elite controller, you've got these buttons here, which are, right now the trigger stops are off. So I've got the full range of trigger there. But on the right one here, I've got the trigger stop on, so it actually stops at the halfway point. Now, I don't generally need trigger stops because I'm not playing first-person shooters with my controller. If I'm going to play a first-person shooter, I'm old school. I'm going to use a keyboard and mouse. But for those who maybe do want that functionality, there is an option for you if you need trigger stops for this controller. And the alternative is getting what is known as Trigger Devils. And I'm not here to advertise Trigger Devils. I don't work for them or anything like that. I probably should have mentioned that in the disclaimer earlier. The only reason I'm mentioning it is the Trigger Devils you can actually apply to this controller or any DS4 controller, and you don't have to open it up or disassemble it and void your warranty. They're just basically stoppers that fit right over the triggers, and they provide you with the trigger stop functionality that you need. The only issue with the trigger stops or the Trigger Devils is number one, be sure if you're going to get them, be sure you get version 2. Don't get version 1 because version 1 had some issues and they went ahead and fixed those issues in version 2. The other issue is they're kind of pricey, in my opinion. They're $25 and all they are is just a piece of plastic. I mean, when you see them, I mean, I know when I look at them, I'm like, this is not worth $25. If they were like $15, I'd probably pick up a pair, but I'm not paying $25 for trigger stops. But for those of you who don't care and they really want that, that's an option for you. All right, so we're done talking about triggers. Let's go ahead and move on to the bumpers. This one's going to be real short as well. The bumpers, they are a little bit more sensitive than the standard stock controller, but nothing, I didn't really notice too big of a difference, just a little bit more sensitivity. As far as cons, can't think of any. They're pretty much the same as the stock. All right, so now let's move into the thumbsticks. Now, this is actually a big section here that we need to talk about. Okay, so these thumbsticks, Evil Controllers has their own proprietary thumbsticks. And I've got some here. These are the thumbsticks that come with the controller. This, I think, is the middle range one. And you get a total of 6. You get 2 short, 2 medium, and 2 long. Okay, and here's the bottoms. So you can kind of see how it's keyed there. See if I can get good light in there. Okay, so I don't know if it focused or not. Obviously you can tell that the thumbsticks are in fact removable. And that's great. I personally don't see myself needing to be removing them too often because I like the short thumbsticks because of the way of my play style. I know more of the professional gamers, especially in first-person shooters, like to use the tall thumbstick on the right and the short on the left. And I understand why they do that. I understand the mechanics behind it. I've tried it, and I don't play first-person shooters with my controller much. So I just go ahead and go with the 2 shorts. Now, one pro that I wanted to talk about before I started talking about the removable thumbsticks is the dead zones of these thumbsticks as far as the responsiveness. The dead zone on these thumbsticks is very, very small, and that's good in case any of you are not familiar with the dead zone. The dead zone is basically the distance that you're going to travel when you apply direction with the thumb. So, for example, if I motion down or up, it actually starts to respond in the game sooner rather than later because there is very little dead zone. Which is going to give the illusion that you don't have too much latency or lag, and that's really good. The mechanical mechanisms for the thumbsticks are really good to go. Okay, and now moving back to the actual physical thumbsticks. If you notice, I've got the shorter ones on here, and if you notice, they're the domed thumbsticks, and all of the thumbsticks that you're going to get from Evil controllers are domed. So just be aware of that. That means convex. Now, if you need concave, which some people prefer to play with the concave on the left, you're probably going to need to get some kind of special grip, like a grip like this, to put over it that will give you that ability to have concave. I use these thumb pads mainly just for better grip, but they're pretty much flat, but when I put them on here, they're actually domed. I actually prefer the domed, so that's a win for me on that part. And the dome texture, if you don't choose to use any kind of rubber thumbstick grip, you can just use the default, and there is a nice texture to the surface of these sticks, but I highly recommend get yourself some thumbstick grips. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the diameter of the thumbsticks. Not the actual tops of the diameter, but the sticks themselves. The sticks here, like the distance from one edge to the other. I don't know if that focused too well. So here and here. Okay, if you notice that the diameter on that stick is pretty thin, but you're not really having anything to compare that to. So let me see if I can bring in the stock controller. Now, if you look at the stock controller, look at how thick that is. It is quite a bit thicker than the Evil Shift thumbsticks as far as the diameter. Now, this is better, and the reason why is when you give direction to the thumbstick, it allows you to have more mobility to get more function out of that thumbstick. It's almost like basically having the taller thumbstick, but without having to have the taller thumbstick. But the thing is, of course, you can replace it and put the taller thumbstick, so you get more functionality as far as a greater thumb range of motion with these thumbsticks because the diameter of the thumbstick is thinner. Okay, now we're going to get into the cons of those thumbsticks because unfortunately there are some. So the cons for me is, number one, they're plastic. Again, I'm not real big on plastic. And the reason why is because I've heard a lot of these thumbsticks, and I'm not talking about Evo controllers thumbsticks, but just thumbsticks in general that are plastic like this, they usually break. It takes a while, of course, but they end up breaking. I would have preferred that what they had done is something like what we have with the Xbox Elite controller, where you have actual metal thumbsticks. Now, these are the short ones. I probably should have brought the bigger ones, but these are not going to break. I mean, this thing is rock solid. It is not going to break. In fact, I've heard of people throwing their controllers and maybe breaking something else with the controller, but that definitely is not going to break. So the problem, though, with going with a system like this, and if you look at the diameter of the stick here, from this edge to this edge, it's quite a bit thicker. It's almost like the stock Sony controller as far as the diameter on that stick. So if they went with a metal type of thumbstick for this controller that's removable, they would need to probably design their own. And I know it can be done. It's, where there's a will, there's a way. But just make sure they keep that diameter thin. Okay. Now, the next con that I want to talk about, and this one was a problem for me. These thumbsticks are very difficult to remove. In fact, when I got the controller, I needed to swap out the right thumbstick because it had the tall thumbstick installed onto it. And because of the size of my hands, playing with the tall thumbstick just doesn't work too well for me. So I needed to remove it. Well, in the instructions, it does not come with any instructions on how to remove the thumbsticks. And I went online to their website, no instructions. I looked up YouTube videos, nothing there. Did Google searches. I could not find anything. And I assumed, based on what I could see, that they just pulled straight out, and that is the case. If you need to remove them, you need to pull it straight out. Now, I'm not going to do it here because these things fit so tight. I'm very concerned that eventually, over time, if you're pulling it on and off, yes, it may break in, but it may actually break the thumbstick mechanism inside and just rip it out. That's how tight it was. One of the options you may be able to do is take a file and go in there and maybe file that plastic down just slightly, but be careful if you do that in order to loosen it a little bit so it slides off a bit easier. Again, I would prefer this system, where you just pop it on and off. Much, much better system. Okay, so, the last con we need to talk about the thumbsticks. Now, this may not be an issue for some people. However, for me, I guess I'm OCD, but when you're doing full range of motion on the thumbstick, if you notice, like I'm doing full range of motion, notice how you can see straight down to the components of the controller. You can see straight down to, if it can focus, there we go. You can see straight down into the motherboard or gamepad board and the thumbstick mechanism. And that means that this is going to be susceptible to dust collection. And over time, it's going to collect dust, which means over time, this is going to wear out faster. The original stock controller, you're not going to see anything. It's completely sealed. And so I'm not saying dust isn't going to get in there. It is. Dust is always going to find a way in, but it's going to be very difficult to get in on a stock thumbstick like this. So I highly suggest that they work on a way to figure out how to cover that, to prevent the dust. Actually, if they were to go with a system like this, to where you could just remove it like that, then they could go with something like that, and that would fix that problem as well. So again, I'm not really sure why they chose to go that route, but not exactly the best solution from a designer standpoint. And by the way, I did go to art school, and part of what my degree entailed was concept design and product design. So I do have a bit of a background on things like this when it comes to engineering and whatnot. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the next category, which is the grip. Okay, so the grip of the controller, if you notice, let me compare both the stock and the shift controller. So here's the stock controller. Now, I don't know if you can tell too much, and for those of you who are familiar with the controller, it does have a grip to it, but it's kind of like a grid, and it's very, very tiny. It's not smooth, and it doesn't leave fingerprints, which is really nice. I like it. You know, I don't have any particular issues with it. And the grip on the Evil controllers, they've kind of added their own textured water splatter grip, which feels it does feel nicer than the standard default grip here. And again, that's just my opinion. It's a rubbery type of feel. It feels good in the hands. It isn't sticky, because sometimes you'll get, like, you know, some rubber, like I've gotten rubber thumbsticks that were actually sticky. It just feels horrible. These do not stick. And this does not stick either, so when you're holding it. And it's not because my hands are dirty, because I wash my hands religiously. I'm a little bit OCD about that as well. So, you know, some of you have probably experienced that, where you'll get like some kind of rubber product or whatever when it comes to a controller, and it's sticky. In fact, my Nintendo Pro controller, the actual thumb grips on that controller are sticky. And I have cleaned that controller I don't know how many times, and of course my hands are clean, but the damn thing still is sticky. So it has something to do with the rubber. But unfortunately, whatever rubber or material they're using for this is good. It's really, really nice. It also has a bit of a slight gloss to it. It's not like high gloss, and you're not going to get fingerprints on this, which is really cool. Now we're going to move into the cons. The cons are really, I kind of feel bad for even mentioning this, but just, it's more of aesthetics. It's not about really functionality. But if you notice here, the grip, the texture grip stops right here and right here. I personally would have liked to have seen them go ahead and just texture the whole back, just from an aesthetic standpoint. Even though my hands don't even benefit from the texture that much, because the way I hold the controller, most of where I'm actually holding it from is from the palm of my hand, and this area here, that's what's mostly what I'm mostly touching, so I don't really get a lot of benefit from that, but it's more of an aesthetic thing. The other con that I would have liked to have seen, again, this is more aesthetics, is not really a big deal, is the screw holes here. I would like to have seen them added some kind of screw caps to that, just to kind of cover it up. Again, this is just aesthetics, has nothing to do with functionality. Okay, so now we're going to move into the next section, which is the Evil Home button. The Evil Home button here is literally identical to the PlayStation, the Sony PlayStation default button. As far as the functionality, it doesn't feel any different. It just looks different because it's got their own Evil logo on there. But from my understanding, and from what I've been informed, the reason why the Evil controllers has this, aside from showing that it's an Evil controller, is if you are going to a tournament, this actually certifies this controller as a tournament edition controller, as a pro controller. So that means it's unmodded. So I would imagine, and I don't go to tournaments, and I don't know how the policing is done in regards to controllers, but I'm guessing because of that, when you go to a tournament, they can just look at your controller, they see that Evil logo, and they know, oh, okay, your controller is not modded. Personally, I wouldn't trust that. I don't know how you would go about testing the controller to make sure it doesn't have mods, but I wouldn't really want to just rely just on this, because, I mean, clearly this thing can be taken apart and modded regardless. But that's what I've been told. So, and if you do have one modded by Evil controllers, it's actually going to come with the stock PlayStation button here. So that's the difference. Okay, so the next section I want to talk about is my experience with programming the paddle buttons. Okay, so if you want to program the paddle buttons, what you need to do is you need to hold the share button. This is the way I do it. I press the share button, then the Evil home button, and then you press the whatever paddle button you want to press. And you hold it down at the same time for a second. And what it'll do is, actually, I didn't even know this was going to turn on, so I didn't think about it. Okay, so what it'll do is it'll flash, and then you can assign whatever button to it, and then it'll flash real quickly, and boom, now your button's programmed to that button. And that's how you program the buttons. I forgot to script that, so I had to wing it just then and throw that in. So now, back online with the script, I'm moving into what my experience was with the console play of this controller. Okay, I tested this controller both on Windows PC and console. At the moment, I only own a Nintendo Switch. I'm looking to getting a PlayStation, hopefully for Christmas. Probably just going to get a Sony PlayStation Slim. I'm not going to bother with the Pro just based on what I've researched about it and due to cost. But right now, the only way I've been able to test this on a console is with the Switch. And it plays flawlessly, wired or wireless, using both the stock controller or the EvilShift controller. However, in order to use either controller, as far as the Sony controllers, you will need an adapter to communicate with the Switch. Now, I am using this adapter here. Now, this adapter is the COOV N100, and I will have the link in the description of where to get it. It's real cheap. It's like 15 bucks, and it's real small. It's got good build quality. And just to note, there are people that have given this negative reviews. If you do buy it and you do have issues with it on the Nintendo Switch, unplug it, reboot the Switch, plug it back in, you should be good to go. If it still gives you issues, unplug it, plug it into the PC, reload the firmware, and then plug it back into the Switch, and that should be good to go. I've only had to do that once because I thought it died on me. That fixed it, and I was good to go. But other people that aren't so tech savvy didn't try that, and so they gave it negative reviews. But this thing is very cheap, very small, and works like a charm. And the other thing you're going to need to do, if you're going to just play wired, you can just plug in the wire into that, and this plugs into your Switch. If you're going to play wirelessly, you need this. You're going to want to get the Sony DualShock wireless adapter. Now, people say this is just a standard Bluetooth adapter. It is not. Now, I do not know all the technical aspects of this particular adapter, but it is not just a standard Bluetooth adapter. I'm not going to get into the whole specific technical details because I don't have those handy, but I can assure you it is not the same. So basically what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to plug it in to the COOV N100 adapter, and then you plug that into the Switch. Then you just pair it with either your EvilShift controller or your DualShock controller, Sony stock controller, and you're good to go. And I think that's pretty much it for that. However, if now this is actually a more expensive route. This route will cost you 55 bucks roughly because the Sony adapter is 40, the COOV is 15. So you're looking at $55. However, if you don't care about playing the reason I went with this method is I'm actually using a sharing switch like this, and this sharing switch allows me to connect my computer and my Switch to this device like so. So I basically connect it like this, and then one end goes to my Switch with this device, and the other end goes to my PC. And then when I want to switch the controller that is paired to this adapter, I just hit whatever button to whatever I want, so PC or Switch. However, if you're not doing that and you're just using the controller on the console for the Switch, there's another adapter called the Magic NS adapter, and it's only $28, and it's cheaper, and you should definitely go that route. Okay, now we're going to move on to the PC play. How was my experience with the PC using this controller? It played flawlessly, wired or wireless. There are two great programs to use for a Sony PlayStation controller. One is called DS4 Windows. The other one is the Steam software. Excuse me. Now, I chose to go with the Steam software because the Steam software has a lot of functionality. It has all the functionality that DS4 Windows offers, and it has a lot of functionality that DS4 does not offer. So, in a nutshell, the Steam software is far superior. In fact, I'm considering doing a video review of the EvilShift controller with the Steam software to just show you guys how powerful both of these combined can be, because it's very, very powerful. You can do some really cool and crazy stuff with the controller that, in all honesty, I just started using the Steam software maybe 7-8 months ago. And before that, I was using keyboard and mouse. I've been using keyboard and mouse for almost 20 years before I picked up a controller. And once I went with the controller on the Steam software, oh man, it's just been amazing. But again, I need to do a video separate for that to talk about that, because that's going to be a long video, just like this one. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is customer service from Evil controllers. This one won't be too long, but there's one pro and one con. The pro is they provide great customer service. That's the pro. They provide great customer service. The con is they're extremely difficult to get a hold of on the phone, email, or Facebook Messenger, which has been my route of attempts to trying to contact them. Let me give you an example. I had been contacting them by phone and by email and by Facebook Messenger for about 2 or 3 weeks. And I never got a response from email. And it took 2 weeks for them to respond to my Facebook message. And I never got return. All the phone calls I got went straight to voicemail. And I never got a call back. Well, okay, I did actually. But it took them, over almost 3 weeks before I got a call back. And the representative that called me back, his name was Josh. Now, this guy was awesome. He was a great guy to talk to. We probably talked on the phone for probably a good 45 minutes, because if I'd have known he would have been calling, it would have been a much shorter phone call, because I would have been able to have an itemized list of all the questions I wanted to ask him in regards to this controller. But I didn't have the list available handy to me. I was kind of busy at the time. And considering I was starving for their response, I just kind of had to go in there and just try to play catch up and recall of what I wanted to ask about it. But he was very good. He was very knowledgeable about all the questions. I mean, there were a few things he wasn't too knowledgeable about, but that, he was actually mostly a sales rep more than a technician. But he works with the technicians, and he does have a lot of product knowledge about the controller. So even though he's a sales rep, don't let that fool you. He's pretty knowledgeable, and he treated me very well. So kudos to Josh. You did a really good job. Unfortunately, you guys really need to work on your customer service. I mean, you need to do it. I really strongly encourage that. And just to let you guys know, on the reviews that I did review of the Evil controllers, not the Shift controller, but the Evil controllers from other people who did YouTube videos, they all said the same thing. The customer service was pretty bad. But I'm not going to knock it completely, because like I said, if and when you actually do get a hold of them, they're very good. In fact, once I did get a response from the Facebook Messenger, whoever responded to me, they responded very well. They answered all my itemized questions. Unfortunately, it was after I spoken to Josh, so I had already gotten my questions answered. But they were very good and very friendly. So they do have good customer service. It's just they're very difficult to get a hold of. So hopefully they can work that out. Okay, the next section I want to talk about is the price point. The EvilShift controller currently is being sold at a discount of $169.99. And the question is the EvilShift controller worth the price point of $169? Obviously, this is subjective. For me, at $169, I'm going to say yes, and I can say that with confidence. If, however, Evil Controllers plans to market this at $199 as advertised, meaning they didn't just do that as a marketing ploy to just get people to buy, I'm going to have to say no. I do not think this controller is worth $199. I think a smart thing to do from a business standpoint, an economical standpoint, keep it at $169. And let me tell you why. This controller from Xbox, the Xbox Elite controller, this is $130. This controller is rock solid. This is a very well-made controller. Now, granted, it doesn't have exact all the functionalities that this has. This has some functionalities that the Xbox Elite doesn't have, but this has functionalities that this doesn't have. And obviously, I'm kind of comparing apples and oranges here to a certain extent. But the point I'm making is, I do think that they should be charging about $169, somewhere around that ballpark. But I don't think they should go any higher than that because of consideration that you can get a controller like this for $130. Because if you're going to go to $199, I probably won't buy another one for $199. I'll probably look for another Pro controller if they're going to go that high. But if they keep it at $169, I'm definitely looking to getting another one. So anyways, I think one of the main reasons they may end up having to bump it to $199 is because they have probably a lot of overhead, and they're not as big a company as what Xbox is, so that could be the reason. Hopefully they won't have to do that, and that's another reason why I'm doing this video, because even though I'm not affiliated at all with Evil Controllers, I like their products. Even though there's some things that I would like to see changed or improved, I do like their products, and I do think that with more people going to them and, picking up a controller like this, they're going to get more business, which means their business is going to grow. That means they're going to be able to provide better quality products, maybe even at a lower price point, very much like what we're seeing from Xbox. And it's just a win-win for everybody. So hopefully they see it that way. Who knows? All right. So I think this is the last point before I get to my closing is, should you buy this controller? Should you buy this Evil Shift controller? This is entirely subjective again. So with that said, my advice is to take what info you can from this review. Base it on what your needs are and what you're willing to spend. For me, I'm more than pleased with the controller, aside from the things that I want to see changed or added. As I mentioned, I am considering buying a second one, but there are some things I want to discuss with Evil Controllers if I can get a hold of Josh again, because I was informed today that it is possible to add the master mod to this controller. And that is $50, which I'm fine with. And apparently it might offer some of the other things I'm looking to have. The two things that I'm missing from this controller that I would really like to have is full button remapping. Not just button remapping of the paddles, but all the buttons, except for maybe the home button and the share and options button, but full button remapping. And I would like the ability to add a turbo button to whatever I assign it to. And maybe add the ability to add some cosmetic changes. I wouldn't probably go too far about decking or pimping out my controller, but I wouldn't mind having some chrome red D-pad with chrome red triggers and bumpers and maybe chrome red buttons, just accents to offset the black. But I'm sure in time they'll offer something similar to that. Okay, that is my full review of the DS4 Evil Shift controller by Evil Controllers. I'm going to ask that you please like the video if you found it helpful, and dislike if you found that you did not find it helpful. Please ask questions, leave feedback, and constructive criticism if you did not like the video. I am not a professional YouTuber, which, as you notice, I'm not. To save myself time, because I want to get back to gaming, I'm not going to be doing any light correction, sound correction, or throwing this into a video editor or a whole studio. And I'm not really too interested in going professional with reviews, only because of the demonetization problems that YouTube has. because I realize how much work these reviews are for a lot of these YouTubers and the work that is required to do it. And for those of you who have never done it and you think it's just somebody sitting behind a camera and it's really easy work, it is not. There is a lot of work involved. For me, this one wasn't too bad because I'm doing it on the cheap and I'm doing it on the fly. But for those who are doing it more professionally, where they have a studio, they have lighting, they have a good sound system, they got a more professional camera, they're doing color correction, sound correction, they're doing video editing, and all this extra stuff, and doing special kickbacks and things like that. That's a lot of work. So you definitely want to appreciate those YouTubers. And when these YouTubers are putting in all this work and they're getting demonetized, I'm not willing to put in all that kind of work only to get demonetized. For this, I'm willing to do it, but this is not something I plan to do as a profession unless that demonetization issue stops or improves. If it does, then I would look into doing this more on a professional level. So anyways, with that said, I think I'm done here. Thank you for watching, and I hope if Evil Shift Controller is not something that is going to work for you, that you are able to find something that does. Okay, good luck, guys, and happy gaming.